She was 39 years old and had exactly $6 to her name when the men of Loxbaholo gathered outside the old Cutter Icehouse to watch her make what every one of them was certain would be the worst mistake of her life. The man who had ruined her was her late husband's own brother, Silas Whitfield, who had used a forged signature and a compliant county clerk to strip her of the family dairy farm not 4 months after the funeral, leaving her with a wagon, a trunk of clothes, and whatever coin she could scrape from selling what furniture the auction hadn't already claimed. What she had left after that, folded into a handkerchief and tucked against her chest, was $6, and with it, on a bitter gray morning in the winter of 1891, Clara Meadows bought the ruined, half-collapsed ice house on the edge of Larkspur Creek that had sat abandoned for 11 years, its roof caved with rot, its great sawdust-packed ice pit long since melted to a black and stagnant pool. The men outside laughed behind their gloved hands as she signed the paper, certain they were watching a desperate widow throw away her last coin on a building not even fit for firewood. But beneath the frozen, ruined floor of that forgotten ice house waited something sealed away for over a decade, something that would not only change the fortune of one grieving woman, but would still an entire valley into silence when its truth finally came to light. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Meadows. If you've ever been counted out by people who thought they knew your whole story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Clara Ann Doyle was born in 1852 in the rolling dairy country of Loxbaholo, a narrow green valley in the Appalachian foothills where cold mountain streams ran fast enough, even in summer, to keep butter firm and milk sweet for the better part of a day. She was the second of 4 children born to Thomas and Mairead Doyle, Irish immigrants who had come to that valley in the 1840s with little more than a milk cow, a handful of tools, and the fierce, practical faith that hard work compounded like interest if a person was patient enough to let it. Thomas Doyle was, by trade and by temperament, an icehouse man, one of a small, respected fraternity of laborers across the valley who spent every winter cutting great blocks of ice from the frozen creek and packing them in sawdust and straw inside deep wooden pits, preserving them through the hottest months so that the valley's dairies, its taverns, and later its small hospital might have ice enough to keep food from spoiling and fevers from climbing unchecked. It was cold, exacting, dangerous work. A man could lose fingers to the sore, his footing on the ice, and drown beneath the very blocks he were harvesting, and Thomas took a quiet pride in doing it well, a pride he passed to his daughter in the particular way that fathers sometimes pass their trade to a child who shows an aptitude for it rather than to the child who happens to be born a son. Clara had, from an early age, an unusual gift for understanding cold, not merely tolerating it, as most people did, but reading it the way other people read weather or soil. She could tell by the sound an ice saw made cutting through the creek whether the ice below was 6 inches thick or 8, could judge by the particular blue-white color of a block whether it had frozen slow and clear or fast and cloudy, could pack a pit with sawdust in such careful, insulating layers that ice her father cut in January would still be cold enough to numb a hand in the dog days of August. Thomas would take her out onto the frozen creek before dawn on cutting mornings, bundling her in her older brother's cast-off coat since none of her own kept the wind out well enough, and teach her to read the ice the way she imagined other fathers taught their sons to read a Bible with reverence, with patience, and with the unspoken understanding that some knowledge, properly kept, was itself a kind of inheritance. Ice remembers everything that went into making it, he told her once, crouched beside a block so clear she could see clean through to the creek stones beneath, the coal that made it, the water that fed it, even what got frozen in by accident. She did not understand, at 8 years old, how literally true that lesson would one day prove to be, though she never forgot the particular gravity in her father's voice when he said it. She married young, at 20, to a gentle, hard-working man named Edwin Meadows, who owned a modest dairy farm on the valley's northern slope and who had loved Clara, by every account those who knew them gave, without complication or condition from the very first spring. He watched her help her father load ice blocks onto a wagon with more strength and skill than most men twice her size. Edwin's younger brother, Silas, was a different sort of man, entirely restless, ambitious in a hungry rather than a hopeful way, prone to schemes that promised quick returns and rarely delivered them, and possessive of resentment toward his steadier, more contented brother that he masked, most of the time, with an easy smile and an eager willingness to help around the farm whenever it suited his own purposes. Clara and Edwin built, over 19 years of marriage, a modest and well-regarded dairy operation, and though they were never blessed with children who survived past infancy, a sorrow Clara carried privately and rarely spoke of, even to Edwin they found in the farm itself and in the rhythms of the valley seasons a kind of quiet, sufficient happiness. Edwin often said that Clara understood the farm's ice house better than he understood the cows, and it was true that she took over its management entirely in their later years together, maintaining it with the same careful attention her father had taught her, ensuring the Meadows farm was one of the few in the valley whose milk reliably stayed sweet through even the worst heat of July. It was this steady, patient life that came apart with shocking speed in the autumn of 1890, when Edwin, only 4 years old, collapsed while repairing a fence line and died before the doctor could be summoned from town, leaving Clara a widow with a farm, a herd, and as she would soon discover legal vulnerability she had never thought to guard against. Edwin, trusting to a fault, had years earlier signed a document during a lean season, borrowing a modest sum from his brother Silas to cover a bad year's taxes, a debt Clara believed had been repaid in full, evidenced by Edwin's own ledger entries marking the sum returned with interest. But the paper Silas produced after the funeral, a deed of trust granting him partial claim to the farm's land pending repayment bore, Clara was certain, though she could never prove it, a signature that did not match her late husband's careful, looping hand in any of his other correspondence, a forgery skillfully enough done to pass before a county judge who had neither the expertise nor, Clara suspected, the inclination to look closely at the brother of a respected but recently deceased farmer. Within 4 months, working through a compliant clerk and a lawyer paid in favors, Silas Whitfield had pressed his claim through the courts, purchased Clara's supposed remaining share for a sum so insultingly small it barely covered her legal costs, and taken possession of the farm his brother had spent 19 years building, while Clara, grieving and outmaneuvered, watched the herd she had helped raise and the ice house she had tended with her own hands pass into the keeping of a man who had never done an honest day's labor in his life. She might have gone to live with a younger sister, Nora, who had married a shopkeeper 2 valleys over and who wrote pleading letters begging Clara to come stay with them until she found her footing. But something in Clara, some stubborn inheritance from a father who had taught her that cold, properly respected, could preserve almost anything through the hardest season, resisted the idea of arriving at her sister's door as a burden rather than a woman still capable of standing on her own. It was in this state of grieving, proud determination that she found herself on a bitter January morning, standing outside the old Cutter Icehouse at the edge of Larkspur Creek, a building that had belonged a decade earlier to a reclusive ice merchant named Josiah Cutter, who had died suddenly in 1880 with no known family, leaving the ice house to fall into disrepair and eventual county seizure for unpaid taxes, its roof rotting, its great ice pit long since thawed and stagnant, avoided by most of the valley's children as a place where, local legend insisted, old Cutter's ghost still tended ice that never came. The county had listed it among a handful of worthless properties to be auctioned off that January morning alongside a burned barn and a flooded root cellar, properties no sensible person wanted, and when the auctioneer read out the former Cutter Ice House, condition poor, sold as is, several of the men gathered including, Clara noted with a private, bitter satisfaction, Silas Whitfield himself, come to gloat at the diminished circumstances, actually laughed aloud at the notion anyone would want it. But Clara remembered the Cutter Ice House from her girlhood, remembered her father speaking of Josiah Cutter with an odd mixture of respect and wariness that she had never fully understood, remembered that whatever ruin had overtaken the structure, it had been built, in its day, by a man who understood ice as well as her father had. And she thought, with a peculiar clarity that comes to a woman who has already lost everything she thought she could not live without, that $6 for 4 walls and a roof, however broken, was better than arriving at her sister's door with nothing at all to call her own. She raised her hand before the laughter had even fully died down, and the startled auctioneer, having expected no bids whatsoever, sold her the ice house for every last cent she carried, while Silas Whitfield watched with an expression of such open, contemptuous amusement that Clara made a private vow, walking away from that auction with the deed folded in her coat pocket, that she would rather freeze in the ruined ice house through the whole of that winter than ask her husband's brother for so much as a warm meal. The walk out to the ice house took the better part of an hour through packed snow, and when Clara arrived, pushing open a door that hung crooked on one rusted hinge, she understood fully, for the first time, just how far her circumstances had fallen. The roof had partially collapsed over what had once been the main storage chamber, admitting drifted snow that had frozen into a jagged white crust across half the floor, and the walls, though built of thick, well-fitted stone in the old style, were streaked black with decades of damp and neglect. The great central ice pit, normally a deep pit lined with insulating straw and sawdust, dug well below the frost line so that ice packed within it might survive the summer heat had, over 11 years of abandonment, filled partly with fallen debris and frozen rainwater, forming a shallow, blackened pool of ice that looked, in the dim afternoon light, less like a place of preservation and more like something better left undisturbed. But the northern storage room, Clara found, picking her way carefully over fallen timber, had fared far better, its thick stone walls and heavy timber roof largely intact, dry enough that she thought, with the same practical calculation that had guided every decision of her adult life, that a person could keep a fire going there and survive the winter, however meagerly. She spent that first night wrapped in every blanket her trunk contained, feeding a small fire from broken timber pulled from the collapsed section, and told herself, listening to the wind find every gap in the old stone walls, that she would take stock of her situation properly once daylight came. It was on her fourth day at the Icehouse, while clearing frozen debris from the edges of the main pit in the hope of at least making the building's central chamber usable again, that Clara's eye trained since childhood to notice things about ice and cold that other people never thought to look for caught something that struck her as deeply wrong. The frozen black pool at the bottom of the pit did not sit at the depth she would have expected given 11 years of accumulated debris and rainwater. It sat too high, as though something solid lay beneath the ice itself, filling space that should, by any reasonable calculation, have been empty. She thought at first that it might simply be years of fallen stone and timber frozen into the pool, an unremarkable explanation for an unremarkable oddity, but something in the careful, deliberate way the frozen surface at level in a manner that natural debris rarely settled pricked at the same instinct her father had spent her girlhood cultivating, the instinct that told her ice, properly read, could reveal what lay hidden beneath it as surely as any spoken word. She spent the better part of 3 days chipping carefully at the edges of that frozen black pool, working with a patient, unhurried technique her father had taught her for harvesting ice without cracking it unpredictably, breaking the frozen surface into manageable sections and holding them clear rather than attacking it all at once in a way that might collapse whatever lay beneath into ruin. By the third afternoon, with her hands numb despite her gloves and her back aching from the unfamiliar strain, she uncovered, beneath the last thick slab of old ice, a wooden hatch set flush into what she now realized was a false floor built into the base of the pit itself, a floor that had been constructed, quite deliberately, some considerable distance above the pit's true depth, creating a hidden space below that 11 years of accumulated ice and neglect had sealed away as effectively as any vault. Her hands trembling now from more than cold, Clara worked the hatch free, and found beneath a narrow ladder descending into a dry stone chamber, insulated from the pit's cold by the ice itself, that Josiah Cutter had built, it seemed, with the same exacting care he had brought to his ice trade, and had kept secret from everyone in Larkspur Hollow for reasons she was about to understand. The chamber below held, first, a small iron strongbox, and beside it, wrapped carefully in oil canvas to protect it from any dampness that might find its way through the stone, a thick leather-bound journal filled with Josiah Cutter's own careful hand. What Clara read there, sitting on the chamber's cold stone floor with a lantern she had fetched from a makeshift camp above, unwound a story the valley had never known about its own reclusive ice merchant. Cutter, it turned out, had not simply been the odd, solitary man local legend remembered him as. In the years before his death, he had served as a quiet financial guardian for a group of Valley families' widows, often children, and a handful of formerly enslaved people who had settled in Larkspur Hollow after the war and found, as black families so often did in that era, that the Valley's single bank was reluctant to hold their savings safely or lend against their small claims of land. Cutter, whose own family had lost everything to a bank failure in his youth, had made it his quiet practice to hold funds in trust for these families, recording every deposit and every promise return meticulously in his journal, using the Icehouse, a place no one thought to look for money, precisely because it seemed to hold nothing but frozen water, as his private vault. The strong box held gold coin, patiently grown through Cutter's careful, honest investments in valley land and modest local ventures, along with signed promissory notes and, most importantly, several original land claims that Cutter had held in trust to protect vulnerable families from exactly the kind of legal maneuvering that had, ironically and painfully, just cost Clara her own farm. The journal's final entries, dated only weeks before Cutter's sudden death, spoke of his intention to formally transfer the trust to a lawyer he trusted in the county seat, a transfer death had interrupted before he ever completed it, leaving his careful decade of quiet stewardship sealed beneath the ice, waiting. Clara sat with that journal for a long while, the lantern flame throwing long shadows against the chamber's stone walls, understanding with a slow, dawning gravity that what she had found was not treasure meant for her own relief. However desperately she needed relief, but a promise made by a careful, honest man to families who likely had no idea any of it still existed. She thought of her father's words on the frozen creek, that ice remembers everything that went into making it, and understood now, sitting in this hidden chamber built by another Iceman's careful hands, just how literally true that lesson had proven, for here was a piece of the valley's true history, its quiet injustices and quieter kindnesses, preserved as faithfully as any block of ice her father had ever cut, waiting 11 years for someone patient enough and honest enough to bring it back into the light. Finishing what Cutter had started proved, however, considerably harder than discovering it, for it travels through a small valley with the speed of meltwater down a mountainside, and it was not long before Silas Whitfield, who had taken to watching Clara's activities at the Icehouse with a proprietary suspicion of a man who resented anyone's good fortune but his own, learned, through a hired hand he had set to watching her, that the widow he had cheated was spending unusual hours at the ruined Icehouse, hauling ice and debris with a determination that seemed disproportionate to a building most considered worthless. When his hired man reported seeing Clara emerge from what appeared to be some sort of hidden cellar carrying a heavy strong box, Silas's interest sharpened considerably, and he arrived at the Icehouse himself within days, offering, with the same false generosity he had shown at Edwin's funeral, to purchase the Icehouse back from her for $15, a sum meant to seem impressively generous to a woman he had left with 6, but transparently calculated by anyone who understood, as Silas clearly suspected, that whatever she had found beneath that ice was worth considerably more than a ruined building's fair market price. Clara, drawing on the same steady patience that had let her wait 3 days to properly clear that frozen pool without collapsing what lay beneath, refused him with perfect courtesy and gave nothing away in her expression, though Silas's eyes, lingering too long on the door of the northern storage chamber, told her plainly that her refusal had only confirmed his suspicions. Silas did not wait long to act. Within the week, he had filed a formal claim with the county asserting that any contents discovered on the Icehouse property rightfully belonged, under an obscure provision regarding abandoned estates, to the nearest surviving claimant of the original owner, claim he supported by producing, through a genealogical connection so distant and dubious that even the county clerk raised an eyebrow reading it aloud, evidence that his late wife's grandmother had been a Cutter by birth, making Silas, by his own tortured legal reasoning, Josiah Cutter's rightful heir. It was, Clara understood immediately, the same pattern of manufactured legal legitimacy that had cost her the farmer man with just enough money for a lawyer and just enough shamelessness to press an absurd claim, banking on the fact that a grieving widow with almost nothing left would lack the resources to fight him properly. But this time, Clara was not entirely alone, for as she had begun, carefully and quietly, tracing the family's name in Cutter's journal, she found that several of them still lived in Larkspur Hollow, and that the Freeman family in particular, whose grandmother, Cutter's journal revealed, had trusted him with the savings that should rightfully have secured her son a modest parcel of land decades earlier, land the family had long since given up hope of ever claiming, remembered enough fragments of old rumors about Cutter's ice money that they believed Clara's account without hesitation and stood ready, when the matter came before the county court, to speak on her behalf. The hearing, held in the same modest courthouse where Clara had watched her own farm slip away just months before, drew a larger crowd than the little building typically saw, filled with valley families whose fortunes, they were beginning to understand, might hang in the balance of whatever the judge decided that day. Silas's lawyer argued his genealogical claim with the same practice, confusing confidence Clara recognized from her own early ordeal, clearly expecting a widow with no legal counsel of her own to fold beneath language designed to overwhelm rather than clarify. But Clara, standing before the same judge who had ruled against her months earlier, spoke not as a desperate woman defending a lucky find, but as an ice merchant's daughter defending a trust, explaining, in the plain, unhurried cadence her father had used on frozen creek mornings, that Josiah Cutter's journal named specific families by name, recorded specific sums with specific dates, and made no mention whatsoever of any Whitfield or Cutter descendant living or dead, while Silas's claim rested on nothing more than a distant, disputed bloodline and a transparent hunger for money he had done nothing to own. She called forward the Freeman family, whose testimony about the old rumors of Cutter's trust, combined with the journal precise, dated entries recording their grandmother's deposits, could not easily be dismissed as coincidence or fabrication, and she reminded the judge carefully, without the bitterness she felt entitled to, but without softening the truth either that the county itself had declared the Icehouse and its contents worthless when it sold the property for $6, forfeiting, by its own prior judgment, any basis and now disputing who held rightful claim to what she had found. The judge, who had perhaps begun to sense, watching Silas Whitfield's lawyer strain increasingly thin legal threads to justify an increasingly transparent grab, that he was witnessing the same pattern of predatory opportunism twice in one winter against the same woman, took considerably less time to rule than anyone expected. He dismissed Silas's claim entirely, ruling that Cutter's journal constituted clear and sufficient evidence of intent, that the trust described within it belonged, as specified, to the families named, and that Clara, as the Icehouse's lawful owner, held the proper standing and responsibility to see that trust finally, faithfully distributed. Silas Whitfield left the courthouse that afternoon to a silence far more damning than any shouted condemnation could have been the Valley's families, gathered in numbers to witness a ruling that touched several of their own fortunes, simply watched him go without a word. And it was a silence, several who were there later remarked, that seemed to follow him through Larkspur Hollow for the rest of his days, as neighbors who had once done easy business with him began finding quiet, unspoken reasons not to, and the modest respectability he had built atop his brother's stolen farm crumbled, not through any dramatic reckoning, but through the slow, cumulative weight of a valley that had finally, collectively, stopped pretending not to notice what kind of man he was. What Clara did with Cutter's trust in the months that followed surprised even those who thought they had already witnessed the full measure of her character. She did not keep the gold for her own comfort, though heaven knew a widow left with $6 had every reasonable claim to some portion of unexpected fortune. Instead, working carefully through Cutter's meticulous journal entries, she tracked down every family he had named, and where families had moved on or passed away, located whatever descendant she could find to receive a rightful share. The Freeman family finally received the land claim that should have secured their grandmother's son a farm decades earlier. Land Clara helped them file properly this time, with a lawyer paid from the trust itself to ensure no clever relative could ever again threaten to take it from them through forged paper or manufactured bloodlines. Other families received their grown savings, modest but meaningful sums that mended roofs and bought seed, and, in one case, paid for a young man's long-deferred schooling. Clara kept from the whole discovery only enough to repair the Icehouse's collapsed roof and to properly restore its ice pit to working order, and rather than sell the property or abandon it to ruin again, she reopened it that following winter as a cooperative icehouse, serving the valley's dairies and its small hospital on terms fair enough that no family, however modest their circumstances, would ever again go without ice through a hard summer for lack of coin, its operation governed by a simple charter Clara herself wrote, ensuring the Icehouse could never again fall into any single person's private, exploitative control the way both it and her own farm nearly had. She was 39 years old when her husband's brother took her farm from her through a forged signature and a compliant clerk, and she had $6 left to her name when she bought a ruined, laughed-at Icehouse that every sensible person in Larkspur Hollow considered the last desperate act of a grieving widow with nowhere else to turn. Clara Meadows never forgot the sound of that laughter outside the county auction, nor the particular satisfaction in Silas Whitfield's face as he watched the sign for a building he was certain was worthless. But she came, in the years that followed, to understand that the very qualities that had made her purchase seem so foolish that bitter January morning, her stubborn refusal to dismiss a thing as worthless simply because ruin had settled over its surface. Her father's patient teaching that ice, properly read, reveals everything that went into its making. Her own quiet faith that some truths simply need enough cold, enough time, enough careful hands to finally come to light with the very qualities that let her finish, at last, the interrupted trust of a lonely, honest man who had died before he could complete it himself. What she found beneath that frozen pit was never hers to keep, and she understood that from the very first page of Cutter's careful journal. It was a debt owed to an entire valley, sealed away by circumstance and sudden death, waiting patiently, the way only ice and honest intentions can wait, for someone willing to look past a ruin and believe, against every reasonable expectation, that something worth saving still remained beneath it. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Clara Meadows' story tonight. If her patience, and her refusal to let other people's laughter decide what she was capable of, meant something to you, we would be grateful if you shared this story with someone who might need reminding that being counted out is never the same as being finished. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something, or in yourself, that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and we love hearing where these stories find you. Until next time, stay close.